Thinking about belief again. Keep going back to belief. It's quite an interesting idea, I think. And specifically, I'm thinking about what it means when we say we believe something. What kinds of cognitive processes are at work when we say we believe something. And specifically, to the extent that that cognition is poetic, and that figurative devices like metaphor are being mobilized when we cognize, when we think. What kinds of poetic, metaphorical images are being mobilized when we talk about belief. And I think when I've spoken about this before, I've talked about it mostly in terms of submission, really just borrowing from the etymology of the word belief, which I believe comes from a word which means to submit. So there's something about submitting which seems to be going on inside us when we say we believe something, particularly submitting to authority. I've said this before, but I'm just trying to probe some of the details of that. Submitting to a kind of authority when we believe something. And I suspect that the default setting for that, or the primary experience which it kind of sets up the terms for the rest, isn't the submitting to authority. Well, there might be two, thinking about it. There's probably a submitting to authority which is social. That experience that most of us have of being, because we're social, tribal, hierarchical primates, that most of us find ourselves at some point in some kind of pecking order. We find ourselves subservient to the whims of bosses, and occasionally we find ourselves in a position of authority, wielding authority over others. So I think there is a very, very familiar experience that most of us have, which is about handing our will over to a certain degree to the authority of another human being. And I think that's part of it, but it's not the only part of it, I don't think. I think the other schema which mobilizes these metaphors to do with belief is to do with sensory engagement, actually. I think in one of my previous videos I talked about that old saying that seeing is believing. I think the reverse of that is also true. I think believing is seeing. So to a certain extent, when we're talking about believing, we're mobilizing a metaphor drawn from seeing. And seeing, I guess the question that follows that is, what's seeing got to do with authority, and what's it got to do with submission? But I think when we do say that we see something, or engage in any kind of direct sensory relationship with something, but probably seeing is paramount in humans, given that something like 50% of our brain is given over to visual processing. When we say we see something, I think we're also kind of submitting to the evidence of our eyes. And it's incontrovertible, that evidence. When I see a tree, as I am doing right now, even though I kind of know a bit of the physics of atoms and molecules and that kind of stuff, and I know a little bit of the kind of philosophy of questions around space and time and those bits, not a lot, but enough to know that objects that seem to exist in space aren't quite as simple as just what appears to be, just what appears in vision. Even though I know that, the evidence in my eyes is uncontrovertible, and I kind of have to submit to the authority of that perception. So I think when I'm talking about submission being equivalent to submission to authority, I think there are two metaphors being mobilized in that belief system. And I think they probably vary. I think they probably vary from individual to individual and circumstance to circumstance. And I think they also probably vary from discourse to discourse. And I'm sure there are probably confusions built up as a result of that. But I would say that for me at least, the two primary metaphors which seem to be falling into place for me when I say I believe something is submission to the authority of another human being, And there are very particular circumstances, I think, now in which I would grant another person authority over me, mostly to do with having superior knowledge, and that would have to be verified in very particular ways. But also this other kind of submitting to authority, which is submitting to the authority of my own perception, my own sensory engagement with the world. It's an odd one, really. I'm going to think a bit more about this, because there is something. I don't know what to say about that. There's something about belief which is both passive and active, I think, at the same time. On the one hand, belief is sometimes feels like it's thrust upon you, and that's the belief that I most closely identify with. That I believe something if it makes no sense not to believe it. If grounds for doubt are lacking, as I think Wittgenstein talks about when he's talking about certainty. If grounds for doubt are lacking, then I'm kind of obliged to believe. But there seems to be another take on belief, related perhaps more to the pragmatic tradition, which I'll try and find time to talk about, which is not to do with having this belief forced upon you in the face perhaps of strong skepticism and all of those things that you try to mobilize sometimes against belief, but the exact opposite of that, in which you kind of force belief upon yourself, in which you make a rational choice, or even an irrational choice, but you make some kind of act of will, in inverted commas, to engage in a certain kind of belief. I have some experience of that, I think. I don't really think of it as belief. I think of it as self-delusion, but I think there are different things going on there. And again, I think they're the possible source of confusion. I think if we're trying to talk together about what our beliefs are, and what the status of belief is in our societies and cultures, then I think it's pretty important to identify which of those it is as well. Whether we're talking about pragmatic belief that we engage in through some kind of act of will, or whether it's a belief that overpowers our resistance and overpowers our doubt. And as I say, these complementary metaphors of what belief is in terms of submission to authority, drawn from our existence as social beings, or submission to authority of the senses, which comes from our phenomenally embedded and embodied being. Isn't that right, guy? My dog, I've got no idea whether my dogs believe things or not. Look at that face.